Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at the FDD. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for coming on once again.
My pleasure.
Big news out of Israel on Monday. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has officially dissolved his war cabinet. So before we dive into what this all means, can you explain the importance of the war cabinet? This comes 8 months after the start of the war.
Sure. The war cabinet was essentially just three people making a lot of the core decisions. They're the senior people involved at the executive level. So this was Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, the Prime Minister of Israel, as well as Yoav Gallant, the Defense Minister of Israel, and then Benny Gantz, who came in from the opposition, former Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Force. The three of them theoretically had the most combined experience, and that they were the wise men making decisions on behalf of the people. You have to remember that this is important primarily because there is no commander-in-chief in the Israeli system. The prime minister is not endowed with the same powers militarily as the president of the United States. So that means that a certain amount of consensus needs to be formed in order for decisions to be taken that have security implications. So this was the mechanism that had been created. There's also something called the Security Cabinet, which is a wider group of individuals. And then there's the broader government itself that can approve of big decisions. What we're seeing right now is the dismantling of a structure that has guided Israel's war efforts for the last 8 months. And we're now headed into uncharted territory without that mechanism.
So I want to talk about an event that could have been the impetus to this, and there were some infighting within the three wise men, as you said, of this war cabinet between the more centrist Benny Gantz and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And Gantz resigned a little over a week ago, and he said that Netanyahu was putting his politics over the safe return of the hostages. So do you think that Gantz's resignation was the impetus of the war cabinet being dissolved?
Well, absolutely, and you have to remember that Gantz, came at all of this from a slightly different place than Netanyahu. However, I think we need to acknowledge here that Israelis of all stripes right now are not. I don't think you really see anybody in the mainstream that's opposed to Israel finishing the war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, for example. Israelis of all stripes see that as important. Similarly, I think most Israelis see the need to probably fight a war on Israel's northern front against the Lebanese Hezbollah, which is Iran's most powerful proxy. The Israelis, I think, generally speaking, understand the imperative of winning this war. I think their differences were about time frame. Gantz was actually asking for Netanyahu to come back with plans for how to get the hostages back, how to win the war writ large, and what the day after scenario might look like in the Gaza Strip. And when Netanyahu was unable to give him those sort of specific plans that he was asking for, that was kind of the moment that the wheels began to fall off the bus. And we saw him, of course, he was actually supposed to announce his resignation on the day of that very dramatic hostage release last Saturday. He put off that announcement for the day because, well, his announcement would have been really overtaken by events. So he announced it on Sunday. Ever since that time, what we've actually seen is something else that has prompted this, which is that there is a right-wing politician by the name of Itamar Ben-Gvir. He is somewhat controversial here in Washington and perhaps in Western capitals around the world. He's sort of pro-settlement, a bit more right of center than even the government itself, which is right of center. And he started to make demands that he be included in this war cabinet. I think it was at that moment that Benjamin Netanyahu realized that if he agreed to those demands, that it would essentially put him and President Biden on a collision course. And so rather than sustain this mechanism and include somebody that he knew would probably inject additional tension with the United States, I think he did this actually for the good of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is, of course, not how it's being painted right now. But I do think that he understood that this would have put him in an untenable position with the President of the United States.
Before we get into what this means for U.S. relations here, I am curious about what this paints. What does this signal to you? Does this signal a form of chaos? Does it seem, what is the sentiment that Israel feels over this? Because you did mention we are in uncharted territory.
No, it feels a bit chaotic, and I think we need to acknowledge that. It doesn't mean that the IDF doesn't have a plan. It doesn't mean that the leadership don't also have plans. I mean, I think we know that the war in Gaza, the objectives are still the same. The war plans for a potential conflagration with Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, I think still largely the same. It's really, I think, a question of having a set of leaders that are trusted by the Israeli people, making decisions in concert, a show of unity. Without that right now, I think it opens up the war it's more susceptible now to politics. Those politics have always been there. Israeli politics are raucous. They are contentious. It's not two parties like here in the United States where it's just one or the other. These are multiple parties that make up a parliamentary majority, and that majority can be toppled quickly. The dynamics change with the introduction of new parties, with people defecting from their old parties. I think these are the sorts of things that we need to watch for right now. I have expected this from the beginning, that the Netanyahu government would not likely hold in perpetuity. That's just not possible in the Israeli system. And what we're watching right now is potentially the unraveling of the government that has held since the war began on October 7th.
And politically, what do you think this does to Netanyahu? Because as we know, Benny Gantz was a more centrist figure, a centrist leader. He has now resigned. Ben-Gvir is even more right of center than Netanyahu. So does this mean that the next phase of this war, perhaps, or the leadership will be more right wing?
You know, it's an interesting question, and at least for right now, I'm not getting the sense that that will be the case. Now, that of course could change, but right now I just don't see it. What Netanyahu has said is that he's going to start engaging with advisors, trusted people that have come out of the system, so former national security advisors, former chiefs of staff, people where he values their opinion, where they have experience in specific matters, where he's looking for advice. And of course, this is still a democratic system, one that is based on consensus. And so, you know, if Netanyahu ended up taking positions that were deemed too right of center, he would hear about it. What we are seeing is that the IDF, which is still in charge of this war, the military that is fighting this war, they continue to engage in best practices militarily. They are very sensitive to the laws of war. Obviously, there's been a lot of scrutiny in recent months about the way that the Israelis have conducted this. It's not going to change any of those rules of engagement. It's not going to change the tactics or very likely the strategies that we see. What I'm really more concerned about right now is whether the prime minister is going to be getting the advice that he needs in terms of victory writ large. This is a long war that's being waged by Iran against Israel. Iran and multiple proxies. We see now 7 fronts where things have turned hot, right? Gaza, West Bank, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Iran itself. This is a complicated war, and the prime minister needs help, and he needs help in as many places as he can get it. And without this mechanism, that's my concern. I think we need to hope here that the Israelis find a way of perhaps building some kind of a new mechanism or working some new process out that ensures that the prime minister gets the relevant expertise and advice that is necessary to wage this battle. Because, again, the Iranians and their proxies are active, and they can be rather brutal, as we've seen over these 8 months.
I know that the war cabinet has been dissolved, but has Netanyahu offered any type of alternative yet? I know it's been just a few hours since it's been dissolved, but what would an alternative look like for help in this multi-front war?
I think we don't know exactly what this mechanism might look like. There is, by the way, a possibility once he's, decided to scuttle this mechanism that some new one could be formed. That also could exclude Ben-Gvir, as this last one did. what's sort of interesting is that Ben-Gvir even wants this role. He is not a seasoned military person. This is not a man that truly understands the various theaters that Israel is fighting, nor does he understand the strategies or tactics. And so, I think he's been primarily focused on the status of the West Bank, which has seen a huge amount of activity. There are multiple Iran-backed terror groups that are operating out of there. We've seen a lot of weapons flowing into the West Bank by way of Iran across the Jordanian border. There's a lot happening in the West Bank. In fact, there was a report that came out, I think it was either last night or this morning, suggesting that Israel has arrested more than 4,000 people that have been engaged in terror-related activities. So it's not to say that the West Bank is not relevant. It is, but maybe Netanyahu comes up with some kind of mechanism that deals with the West Bank that might include Ben-Gvir without including him in, let's say, a broader war cabinet. These are the sorts of things that I think Netanyahu, who is known to be somewhat creative bureaucratically, he's created new ministers in the past, he's created new mechanisms in the past. It's quite possible that he comes up with something that looks like a compromise, but that ultimately keeps things, relatively speaking, at the status quo. But again, I think we cannot deny that there is a bit of upheaval here right now after Benny Gantz's departure. I think that was baked into the equation from the weekend. We knew it was going to happen, and now we're watching Netanyahu try to figure out how to stabilize things and to maybe bring in some new advisors who can help.
And what does this upheaval do to the United States' relationship with Israel currently? Because, as you said earlier, Ben-Gvir asked Netanyahu, or urged him to be part of this war cabinet. Obviously, Netanyahu has since dissolved it. Lawmakers in the United States have called out Ben-Gvir by name. So what does this all mean for U.S.-Israel relations?
Well, I think right now it looks like Benjamin Netanyahu is making sure that the U.S.-Israel relationship remains quite intact. Knowing that that Ben-Gvir is kind of a live wire here, or maybe in some cases toxic. The idea that he's not being included, the idea that Netanyahu did not allow for this, I think is a good sign. I would say, though, that when we talk about the U.S., I am concerned right now that the U.S. may be a little bit more involved in Israeli politics than it should be. We've seen that Benny Gantz several weeks ago, before he made this announcement, he came to the U.S. And he met with U.S. officials against the wishes of his prime minister. That was not a good sign to me. I would also argue that when Anthony Blinken went to Israel last week, just a few days ago, yes, he met with the prime minister, but he also met with members of the opposition, which is not a normal thing to do. We know that that this administration maybe has not been looking upon Netanyahu entirely favorably, and I do get the sense that they are involved more than they should be in how this coalition has been operating, the way that it engages with the United States. This is, I need to be careful here because I can't see everything that's going on, but if the U.S. is involved and we are meddling, this is not a good look for the leaders of the free world. This is not what we do with other democracies. We should not be messing with their politics, even if we don't like how elements of this war have been dealt with or elements of the political spectrum that are involved in this government. This is not America's place. Israel is, at the end of the day, still a democracy. It is still an ally of the United States, and it would be really dismaying to see the United States engaging in ways that it shouldn't.
I am curious what you believe this does to a potential ceasefire deal. You spoke with my colleague last week after Benny Gantz's resignation, and you said there are still a lot of loose ends. Mainly, you're concerned about Hezbollah in the north. What are those loose ends? What about a ceasefire deal? What are you looking out for next?
Sure. The ceasefire deal that's on the table is Biden's deal that he proposed. The Israelis have been lukewarm about it from the beginning. Biden says that it was done with the acquiescence or the agreement of the Israelis. The message out of Israel is that they're still deeply uncomfortable with what's been proposed. Biden, nonetheless, took this to the UN and really tried to enshrine this through the international system. And, the biggest impediment right now to this deal, even though the Israelis are deeply concerned, is that Hamas has not agreed to it. And we continue to see rejectionism on the part of Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, as well as some of the political figures that are based in places like Qatar or Turkey that are also involved in Hamas decision making. And so I think Hamas remains the biggest impediment to a deal being implemented in Gaza. The Israelis, I think, would like to make a deal that brings back more hostages in exchange for a halt in hostilities, not a permanent end to the war, but let's say a few weeks or even maybe a few months if it means getting those Israeli citizens back. That has been on the table ever since. But really, I'd say that the complexity right now is really, in my mind, it's the northern border. Hezbollah has carried out a very large number of attacks, thousands of different missile and drone attacks, some attempted incursions. We've seen a number of soldiers killed and civilians injured and killed inside of Israel. They've burned a lot of arable land. Hezbollah has done this. And really the volume has picked up significantly. And so the Israelis have responded in kind. This, I should note, has been happening since October 8th. The Hezbollah just began firing upon Israel one day after Hamas carried out its attacks, and this has been a constant ever since. I am deeply concerned about this element of the war. I actually don't see these as two separate wars. As I mentioned before, these are both proxies of Iran, funded, armed, and trained by Iran. And really what it looks like is just an escalation, a broader escalation on the part of the Islamic Republic to squeeze Israel now from two sides. And after two sides, we might see three or four. We know that they all exist. We know that they're armed. We know that they're trained and they're ready to fight. So the question is, how far does Iran take this? I still believe this is a multi-front war that is being waged against Israel, not some isolated thing that's been happening in the Gaza Strip.
So let's say there is a ceasefire deal that is eventually agreed to between Hamas and Israel. Does that automatically stop Hezbollah from attacking on the north end?
No, not at all. I mean, it's possible. One scenario is that if the war ends in Gaza in some shape or form, or a ceasefire is implemented, it's actually quite possible that Hezbollah continues to fire. But there's another part of this too, which is, and people are generally not aware of this, that somewhere around 150,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes in the northern communities along that border with Lebanon. Roughly the same number have been evacuated from southern Lebanon. They've been forced to flee as well. What we're looking at here is kind of a no man's land that is cleared out as a result of this war. I don't know about Lebanon, but I can tell you that the Israelis are not willing to cede that ground. And they believe that either we're going to have to see Hezbollah agree to a UN Security Council resolution dating back to 2006, that's UN Security Council Resolution 1701, demanding that all forces, all non-state forces, specifically Hezbollah, retreat north of what's known as the Litani River, which runs east-west across the country about 10 miles north of the border. This needs to be implemented for Israeli citizens to go home, because right now Hezbollah is deployed all across the south with a massive missile and drone threat. They have 200,000 rockets at their disposal, Hezbollah does, with some very advanced weapons, some very scary things that I think the world will soon learn about. This is not sustainable for the Israelis. And so even if a deal is cut on the return of hostages and maybe a pause in fighting or an even end to a fighting, we are still looking at a potential war that, in my view, and I said this last week with your colleague, this could be the most devastating war the Middle East has ever seen. This is the world's most powerful non-state actor, the most powerful terrorist group. They are equal in strength to the average European military with, as I mentioned, 200,000 rockets. That would be a brutal war with Israel. And so this is what we're looking at right now amidst the Gaza war and amidst these discussions about what happens next.
Well, Dr. Schanzer, I hear you raising the alarm. Per usual, I appreciate your insights. And as the situation develops, I hope you come back on and join me again for another conversation. Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime.